So we promised a little bit of time for Q&A. I want to acknowledge that we are way over time here, and I'm sorry for contributing to that myself. But we're going to do our best to catch up. I am going to be here until 6, and so I'm very happy to take questions individually in the foyer after the program's over. But these clinicians, they have places to be. So let's focus the questions for the doctors. And then again, if anyone has any questions, Chordoma Foundation or Chordoma Foundation research related, please see me in the back. I'm happy to stay as long as need be. So we'll take maybe 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll go on. Yeah. Oh, Danny, I think is gonna maybe, or Sarah will run a mic maybe. Or you can go ahead.
Well, I can,
Yeah, we can.
What are the similarities or differences between the tribal and sacred chordomas in terms of structure, in terms of the chemical composition, in terms of the genes, and will the side effects of the treatments be comparable?
So I think they're the same tumor, right? They look the same under the microscope, and they look the same genetically. There probably the biggest difference is their location and how we can approach them, and also at what time point in the cycle of things that tumor presents. So the clival chordomas obviously are not going to be as big as the sacral chordomas because there's just not that much space for it to grow to that size. But somehow a lot of these clival chordomas probably have been around for a while before they get to some of these sizes that we see. And I don't treat any clival chordomas, but until they get the sizes we see, because they tend to invade through the dura many times, which we don't see in the spinal chordomas or the sacral chordomas, because we probably get them in an earlier time period, even though they might be bigger just because maybe they're less constrained by anatomy, right? And I think the location is what makes the clival chordomas a little bit more difficult to treat, because we don't have all the same tools surgically. I don't want to speak for Vinai, but I think that the radiation possibilities are different in these different areas too. So what he was showing you about the clival chordomas and how he makes those plans, and he's talking about all the different cranial nerves in that area and the brainstem and those sort of things that he has to protect. And the spine is the same sort of thing, but it's a little bit different because there he's protecting all of our other things like esophagus and colon and rectum and things like that have different side effects and consequences, and usually different tumor volumes.
Yeah, let me add to that. It's a really good summary by Dr. Wolinsky. Again, from a radiotherapy perspective, number one, for clival chordomas, it's just not possible to do an en bloc resection, right? So that's number one. Number two, it's a much smaller territory in which to try to operate, and so you tend to get more likely what we call iatrogenic seeding, or little things that little bloblets of tumor that end up being left behind, and I have to radiate that. You don't typically see that with sacral chordomas. Number three, there's one important difference from a radiotherapy perspective. In a sacral chordoma, one of the important high-priced real estate are those sacral nerve roots. And those sacral nerve roots are running right through that tumor. In contrast, yes, you can get intradural extension of a skull-based tumor towards the brainstem, but the brainstem's not running through the clival chordoma. Likewise, in a mobile spine tumor, the spinal cord is not running through it. There may be some peripheral nerves that are running through it. But when we're talking about sacral nerve roots running through it, that really impacts things, impacts the role of surgery, and the potential consequences also impacts what I can do, because I can't escalate radiotherapy dose as much in the sacrum as I could in the skull base, because those nerve roots are just right there, and there's no way around it. Does that address your question?
What role do you think carbon ion therapy will play in the future?
So it's a great question. So carbon ion has what we call a higher linear energy transfer. At its point where it stops, just like protons, it's particles, it'll stop at a finite point. At that point where it stops, it deposits more radiation dose per particle than protons do, and or than X-rays do. And that's intriguing because it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, we need to find ways to drive up the dose. We need to do it more safely, because the more dose we can deliver, the longer we can control tumors. The other thing it does introduce is it introduces another type of DNA damage. So when we do radiotherapy with protons or X-rays, we're creating what we call double-strand breaks on the DNA. We're damaging the two strands of the DNA helix. When we use carbon ion with high LET dose deposition, we actually can kill those tumor cells right there and then. We are not depending on mitotic cells. So we have greater opportunities, but we have greater risk. And I think its capacity to be used in chordomas when there's a lot of high-priced real estate around still remains underdeveloped. I think there's some excitement on there. The U.S. still doesn't have a carbon ion facility. People have been talking about it for a long time. But even when it does find its way to the U.S., I'm not sure people are going to jump into trying to really push it. I think it's going to be a gradual thing that will be evaluated.
I'm going to step in and I'm going to add something and ask a question. So there will be a carbon ion center in Jacksonville, Florida, Mayo, I think. I don't know the timing of when it's opening, right? Because it's always a tease, but I'm curious about it. But I'm going to ask Vinai a question about it, because since we don't have one in the U.S., I get little information about it, except for somehow they're springing up in Europe, and I'm not sure where all that money's coming from, but it's great that they're coming up, and they're in Japan as well. Vinai, is the same thing happening with carbon ion as in protons, where yes, you can control where that beam goes and where it stops, but it affects everything it goes through on the way in? I assume it does, but I don't know.
Tanese is really smart. Yeah, smart question. So no, that's very true. So first of all, by the way, I would love it. I know the Mayo Jacks guys very well. I really love it if they can be the ones who install it. But like they say with protons, there's wanting to install a center and there's actually installing a center. It's a lot different. But yes, so the other part to it is that entrance dose with carbon and that LET effect of what happens on the way to hitting its spot is higher. And so, a class example, there used to be a neutron facility here all the way out in DeKalb. You may not know about it. But that, too, had the same thing, so similar to carbon. But we used to treat it for parotid tumors of the salivary gland right here. And the skin reactions patients had was so much more marked than we had ever seen before. And so, again, there's promise, but it has to be safely investigated. So.
We have very limited information and knowledge on that, so maybe ask the question I'm asking you not. I'm just wondering if we treat by proton instead of surgery, possible?
So to be specific for each person, I have to look at the films, right? We both have to look at the films to see what's possible. So in my feeling about these is if you can take that tumor out in one piece in an en bloc resection, then I think surgery is the way to go up front. Now, I will also say that cervical chordoma is a higher risk real estate from a surgical perspective than other areas, so you have to make sure you are seeing somebody who handles that kind of thing. And it really depends where it actually is in the C2 level itself, because even though C2 is not the biggest bone in the world, there's parts of it that's more up towards C1, and there's parts of it that's more down towards C3. And it also depends whether or not those vertebral arteries are involved or what's involved in it, right? So I think those are critical things to understand. I've struggled with a number of high cervical chordomas where, you look at these things and you want to do an en bloc resection, but they're just not possible, right? Or they're not possible safely. And in those cases, if the tumor is not pushing on the spinal cord or threatening a structure at this point, I think it's worthwhile thinking about things a little bit outside the box and maybe trying a non-conventional route of an experimental chemotherapy plus radiation therapy and seeing how the tumor evolves over time and then deciding whether or not to involve surgery for resection. You might need stabilization so that the symptoms are controlled, right? But it's a balance, and this way you can maybe have a different way of thinking about how to control that tumor. But I think, one of the things that I found very amazing about chordoma patients and chordoma families, and Josh is an example of it, but every one of you is an example of it, is that you want to seek out all the information up front, because you might not know who this musician is, but a patient told me about this song, and it's true. So Eminem has a song, and then you get one shot, right? And you want to take that best shot. Take your time, figure it out. These are generally not emergencies you have to get done in the middle of the night. You got time to make sure that you got all the answers. And the beauty of now it is you can contact all these different people around the country to figure it out, to make sure that you're comfortable with whatever decision you make. And whatever decision you make is the right decision.
Can I add to that? First of all, I'm sorry about your daughter, and I hope everything turns out okay. The first thing that I can imagine is she is a lot younger than you, and therefore she is young. So I cannot emphasize what he talked about. The first shot is important, but in that first shot, it's so important to be multidisciplinary about it. And thankfully, Jean-Paul and I have a great working relationship. Sometimes I see patients where the surgeon has already done their job, and they come to me, and it's like, geez Louise, I wish you would talk to me beforehand. Because one of the things that can happen or requires to happen at a C2 lesion is instrumentation. And where that instrumentation goes, and if there's a need for radiotherapy afterward, that really makes things complicated. So my general bias for young people is I want to get as much tumor out as possible. That's my bias. And in that situation, if non-blocker resection is feasible and safe, I would prefer that over proton therapy, because I cannot control that tumor long enough for that individual because they're so young. It's different if they're in their 70s, right? Secondly, again, if there is a need to do some degree of surgery and inevitably requires instrumentation, as Jean-Paul mentioned, and I did not talk about, when there's certain metal that's put in there, protons bounce off those metal pieces, and it becomes very challenging. So oftentimes what I do with Jean-Paul and other spine surgeons across the country is I look at the imaging, we sit down, we talk about it, they tell me their approach, and then I say, hey, this is where I'm thinking about bringing a proton beam in. Can we ensure there's no instrumentation in that area? So I think that becomes an important part of it too. So best wishes to your family, but I hope this helps.
Hello. Thank you guys so much for your presentation. I don't want to send it. I want to ask you about circulating tumor DNA. So someone had mentioned that earlier. What role do you see that playing in the future of chordoma treatment?
Did you say circulating tumor DNA?
Yes, and blood testing.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now it's infancy, and I'm going to put Josh on the spot because we were talking about this before the lunch, or I guess during lunch, and I was keeping him from lunch. But there's one of these. I think they're actually a AI kind of data company here in Chicago called Tempus, and they also do a lot of testing for patients and things like that. But they are doing circulating tumor DNA things for other types of tumors. Chordoma is not one of them yet, but that stuff I was showing you earlier from Dr. Bettigaudo is still early in its infancy. But I think that circulating tumor DNA is something that can be very useful for patients in the future, and understanding where they are in that tumor. And particularly, it might be a very useful thing for patients that are undergoing chemotherapy, whatever you want to call chemotherapy, whether or not it's conventional cytotoxic chemotherapy or immunotherapy or something else, as a way to monitor these tumors. Because, sometimes when we're looking at an MRI scan of a patient with a tumor in there, right? It's a certain size, it's not changing very much, and we don't really know what's going on with it from the treatment, right? And these are slow-growing tumors, so we need a lot of time to figure out, is this effective or not? And the circulating tumor DNA might be something that can help us understand whether or not it's being effective or not. Or if you have somebody who's had a resection, you don't see any tumor there, which is great, but maybe there is still circulating tumor DNA because some satellite lesion like Vinai was talking about that might be in the periphery that we just don't see yet, or we don't know where it is. So I think there is going to be a role for it. I just don't know when. I'm sure it'll be soon, though. And maybe Josh will get it in the 3 weeks from now. That's his job.
We're definitely going to try to work on it. I know there's probably more questions, and so I want to apologize, but I'm getting the signal that we have to wrap up. But again, please feel free to see me or anyone else from the foundation afterwards, and I'm sure Dr. Gondi and Dr. Wolinsky would be happy to take questions either in their clinic or via email. We can connect you with them afterwards. Please join me in just one more round of applause, and thank you to both of them and Victor as well for volunteering their time on a weekend. We really appreciate it.